President's Day. It's week 7, and I can tell by the looks on your face that you're ready for some more of our class on culture of society. This week continues in some ways the traditions we've done from the last 2 weeks, but takes us in a new direction, and a direction that a lot of you anticipated in your discussion post last week. So more on that in a second. Couple of quick announcements. Make sure to always be keeping up with the comments I make on the discussion post, as well as my wrap-up notes. Those are all part of the course. They're not just things I do for the heck of it at the end of a week, but they're actually my way of kind of talking back to you, hearing some of your questions, maybe hearing some things that I wasn't clear enough and that became clear in your discussions. And so I'm trying to kind of bring that all together. This week, again, we have a quiz, a reading quiz. By now, it seems like you guys have the hang of it. And then we just have 2 more weeks before the midterm, actually. The next 2 weeks will actually be some of my favorite weeks in the class, what I consider maybe some of the most interesting ways of thinking about society and culture. But more on that next week. This week, as you can see from the syllabus, and you can see up here on the whiteboard, it's the production of culture approach. This is a technical phrase. We sociologists use it when we talk about this particular way of thinking about culture, and so that's what this week's lecture is about. And then the 2 readings from this week are from 2 of the real leading sociologists, one of whom has just passed, that's Richard Peterson, but 2 of the real leading sociologists on this approach. So in the lecture today, I'll kind of be going loosely through 4 categories. One is background on this approach and some overview. I'm going to talk about art worlds, in particular a sociologist by the name of Howard Becker. Then I'm going to talk about conjunctural causation. That's a fancy way of making some sense of what Peterson talked about in his article about how the heck we got rock and roll. And then finally, I'm going to talk about what we might call the appropriation of culture, or using cultural stuff, cultural material, to try and create authentic selves. A lot of this has actually, as I mentioned, been anticipated by some of your criticisms of last week's approach. So I'm looking forward to what should be a pretty interesting lecture. You can always let me know if you agree with me by the end of it. So let me start off by giving a little background. In particular, let me note some problems with the approach that we've been studying for the last couple of weeks. First off, the last week's readings about the culture industry or mass culture, as many of you pointed out, really had a hard time specifying what the heck the culture industry is. So a number of you had examples about, well, does this kind of broad generalizing about mass culture, about where it comes from, about what it does to us, does that really hold for, say, punk music? Or does it really hold for artisans in a rural area of Tennessee making bluegrass music? So a number of you kind of had these thoughts of like, wait a second, that approach might not work in those cases. And you were right. So despite the fact that we live in an advanced industrial society where there's a great deal of centralization and bureaucratization of the culture industry, think in terms of major record labels or major media companies or major film studios, which surround my life here in Los Angeles. So despite all that, there are still very separate and even autonomous places within these various industries, music industries, videos industries, etc. The internet has only, in some ways, kind of electrified, or if you will, sped up both centralization processes, but also processes of independent producers. So you can now have people producing music on YouTube, literally out of their living room. I think that's what happened on Saturday Night Live a couple weeks ago, or last month, was kind of the latest YouTube star, if you will. And we see that there is some ability outside of the centralized, bureaucratized culture industry to actually make culture, to actually produce cultural material. So that was one problem with last week's approach. Also, and I briefly just mentioned this, that approach couldn't really deal with what subcultures were about. So things like rap music, bluegrass music, independent films, especially in our day. That last week's approach didn't deal with those because in some levels those weren't part of mass culture. When we think of the word mass culture, kind of the lowest common denominator that's able to grab the most amount of people for various reasons of exclusion by mainstream culture industry specialists, as well as exclusion by musicians and artists themselves saying, I don't want to be a part of that. Those parts of the culture industry were separate. And so last week's approach didn't really help us to understand those pockets. Last week's approach also doesn't help us to understand too much how new cultural trends develop. For example, how to make sense of the fact that new musical styles arise. One of our readings from this week seeks to answer just that question. How is it that rock and roll came about in 1955? Last week's approach might have said, there's nothing different. It's just more stuff pumped out by the culture industry. But this week's approach isn't going to be okay with that answer. It's going to look at some more details. And finally, one other reason why this week's approach emerged, so not only was it trying to correct those problems that I just mentioned, but it was also reacting against another school of thinking, which we really haven't talked about where culture comes from. And in DiMaggio's article in the Reader for this week, we hear one snippet of that. So Paul DiMaggio in that article is saying, hey, I'm introducing you to this production of culture approach, and I'm replying to two voices or two schools of thought. One school of thought he's replying to is last week's approach, the critical approach, the mass culture industry approach. And the other approach he's replying against is what he calls the conservative school, which is basically those who say what's produced out there, what we see in magazines, on TV, and through the radio, is there because that's what people wanted. And so therefore the free market and culture works, and all the stuff that's made is simply responding to the demand of what people want. Now, a number of you use that line of thinking, I think, without knowing it in your discussion post last week. And I criticize those heavily because that was not in line with last week's approach. Last week's approach was cynical about that, was opposed to that, and said, no, what's out there is because there are decisions made about the lowest common denominator, least imaginative cultural stuff you could pump out, and people were made to like that. This week's approach, this production of culture approach, is responding against both these camps, saying neither of you are right. So neither the critical group that we studied last week or this conservative free market group, what's out there is because the people wanted it. This week's approach is trying to shoot a middle course and saying neither of those provide the right answers. So let me give you a couple of overview main points for this week's production of culture approach. It is centralized, and this is not surprising at all given the title, on production. So it's trying to figure out how specific material, what we could call the symbolic elements of culture, so specific musical styles, specific fashion modes, specific themes or types of movies, how these things come to be. How are they created? How are they spread? How are they shared? How are they perpetuated? How are they deemed to be more worthy than other cultural themes? So it's really kind of trying to scratch away and look deeply under the surface of how culture gets produced. It breaks the tight relationship that we had been studying in reflection theory. Now recall, reflection theory had kind of a tight relationship between the conditions, especially the economics of conditions of society, and the superstructural cultural stuff that was produced. This week's approach really kind of breaks that and says that the symbolic material or the culture in our society is connected with social and economic forces, but not in the way that Marxists thought it was. So it's not simply just ideological stuff that's a reflection, remember, a camera obscura of the base. Instead, this week, when it looks at economic conditions in particular, it's looking at how those conditions really kind of became part of the elements, and as we'll see in some of the rest of this lecture, the elements that produce or that create culture keeping in mind that at some level humans are involved in this process. It's not just this magical process of reflection, but instead our authors this week are actually trying to look at the minute connections and patterns in history that produce the stuff of culture. And this week's is a little, this week's approach is a little skeptical of the Marxist reflection theory idea that what's ever out here in the cultural world simply supports the status quo. This week's approach is kind of ambivalent about that claim, thinking that, yeah, in some instances, the stuff of culture, the movies, radio, videos, all that stuff could support and mystify the status quo, but not necessarily, and particularly not necessarily in the case where we're talking about subcultural groups who have been basically excluded or outside the mainstream of material cultural life. This approach could be used for all sorts of stuff, and I'm going to give you some examples in the lecture, but we could actually think in a very literal sense. We could pick up our textbook, and somehow mine's disappeared. I think it's in the other room. But we could literally pick up the textbook this week, and we could look at it. Let me grab another one. I'll grab one of my wife's textbooks, and we could say, how is this produced? And this week's approach would literally ask that question. So how did it get this cover? There must have been a tree involved way back in some part. Maybe the tree came from the southern part of the United States or the Pacific Northwest where they cut down trees. Well, how is it that these images came to be a part of it? And this type font had to be invented by somebody. And how is it that these particular authors in the book were decided upon as the most authoritative voices to be talking about what we have in our textbook? There must have been some system of selecting out authorities and deciding some people are more intelligent or more important than others and should be included in the book. So this week's approach really spins out a lot of questions looking at the background conditions that actually produce culture. And so really quickly for this rest of this lecture, I'm going to talk to you about art worlds, which is looking in some great examples of what really goes into producing a piece of art. I'm going to talk a little bit about conjunctural causation, which I mentioned before, which is how numerous different pieces of organizations of industry and society work together to cause a new kind of moment in the production of culture. And then I'm going to say a few words about what I mentioned at the beginning there, appropriation or authenticity. In particular, I'm going to talk about this group of sociologists known as the Birmingham School of Sociologists from England in the 1970s that wanted to understand how we as consumers could actually use the stuff of culture to resist mainstream society or to resist dominant ideological forces. And that was a point that a lot of you really insightfully made in your discussions last week, saying, hey, this doesn't sound like me. This stuff that Adorno and Horkheimer are writing, this doesn't sound like me. I don't just sit and watch and kind of let certain messages be plowed into my brains. And even the fact that we were able to critically think about The Bachelor or The Bachelorette, despite the fact that many of us, me included, have watched that show, the fact that we're able to talk about it critically means that the mass culture approach that sees us as just kind of these passive creatures where our heads are open and we're containers of which messages are dumped in our head, that can't be quite right, because we have some ability to resist or to kind of interact or interpret the elements of culture differently. Let me stop right there really quick. Take a pause. I'll be right back and we'll jump into some of the main portions of this lecture.